The docking bay smelled like metal and burned coolant, the way all transit stations do when they have been running too long without rest. Soreth stood near the ramp with his datapad held flat against two of his forearms and his remaining two folded behind his back. He had 6 of his 8 eyes on the transport ship and 2 on the report he had already read 4 times. 31 humans. That was what the datapad said. He had gone over the numbers twice with his commanding officer and once with High Arbiter Castle himself. The Sovereignty had sent formal requests to Earth for military assistance in Sector 9 Voss, where the Devourant Collective had begun pushing through the outer relay chains with the kind of slow, unstoppable patience that machine empires were known for. The Sovereignty needed fighters. It needed firepower. It had communicated this clearly. Earth had responded. They were sending soldiers. 31 of them. Soreth had looked up the population of Earth before coming to the bay. It was not a small number. The planet had billions of people. It had sent 31. The transport settled with a low groan of pressure equalization, and the ramp extended. Soreth straightened. He had reviewed human biology, human conflict, history, human cultural protocols. He was ready. The first person down the ramp was a woman who looked to be somewhere past 50. She had gray and brown hair tied back without any ceremony, and she was wearing a jacket that had clearly been through a great deal of weather. She was reading a book, a physical book, made of paper, held open in both hands as she walked down the ramp without looking at her feet. She reached the bottom, looked up, registered Soreth with a brief nod, and then found a place near the wall, where she sat down on her bag and kept reading. The second person was a large man with a quiet face and a jacket so faded that whatever color it had once been was no longer easy to determine. He was eating something wrapped in a flat piece of bread. He looked at the station's ceiling. As he chewed, studying it the way a person studies a room they might have to work in someday, he did not look at Soreth at all. The others came down in small groups, talking in low voices or not talking at all. One young woman stopped at the base of the ramp and looked up at the vaulted arch of the docking bay with an expression of open, undisguised wonder, the way a child looks at something very large for the first time. A man with a thin beard and round-framed glasses was already pulling a folded paper from his jacket and writing notes on it. 2 others had found a stretch of floor near the far wall and were simply sitting, eyes closed, resting. Soreth waited for the military formation. He waited for the weapons check, the unit arrangement, the commanding officers stepping forward with rank insignia visible, and a prepared statement of capacity. No formation came. The last person off the ramp was a man of medium height with a plain face and steady eyes. He was not large. He was not heavily built. He looked at Soreth the way you look at a problem you are in the middle of thinking about. Then he walked over and held out his hand. Ray, he said. That was all. Just the name. Soreth shook the offered hand because protocol required it. Then he began the formal debrief he had prepared. He covered the strategic situation in 9 Voss, the collective's current positioning, the Sovereignty's failed attempts to hold the refinery corridor, the anticipated timeline of escalation. Ray listened without interrupting. When Soreth finished, Ray asked 2 questions. The first was about supply line access, specifically which routes were still open for equipment if something needed to be sourced locally. The second was about the atmospheric composition of the primary contested zone, whether the oxygen ratio was close enough to Earth's standard that the humans would not need supplemental gear over long periods. That was all he asked. Soreth had prepared for questions about troop strength, weapons capabilities, orbital support, chain of command, political objectives. He had answers for all of those. He had not prepared for questions about air and supply lines. He answered both questions. Ray nodded, thanked him, and went to find where the others had put their things. The woman who had been reading the book, her name was Nadia, was now sitting cross-legged on the floor with a hand-drawn map spread across her knees. She had done the drawing herself, Soreth realized. During the transit, she had taken the sector data that had been transmitted to the human ship and redrawn it by hand, annotating it with small, neat letters in the margins. The man with the glasses, Dov, had borrowed a chair from somewhere and was working through a stack of Sovereignty military records on a device, but he was also making his own notes beside them on paper. He had a particular look of someone who was not reading to be impressed, but to find something that the original author had missed. Sorth filed his first report that night. He kept the language neutral and professional, but the core of it was simple. The humans had arrived and they did not look like soldiers. They displayed no threat posture, no escalation behavior, and no visible unit structure. He recommended that the sovereignty request clarification from Earth on the grounds that the wrong unit might have been sent. Earth's reply came 14 hours later. It was very short. Those are the right people. Trust the quiet ones. Sorth read it twice. Then he set it aside and went back to his desk. Later, while past the station's rest cycle, he walked past the corridor where the human quarters were. He had intended only to check the environmental controls. The humans had requested a slight adjustment in temperature. He heard laughter. Not the sharp, ritualized kind that came after combat or victory. Not the performance of it. It was the sound of someone in the middle of a story, and everyone else knowing it was a good one. Someone was speaking in a low rolling voice and the others were reacting, some with words and some with that helpless kind of laughter that happens when something is unexpectedly true. Sorth stood outside the door. He had fought alongside 7 different species in his career. He had studied interspecies bonding behavior extensively. He understood the theory of unit cohesion. But this did not sound like soldiers maintaining morale. It sounded like people who had known each other long enough to be completely honest. He did not know what to do with that. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended, listening to something he could not quite classify. Then he walked back to his quarters and sat at his desk and looked at Earth's reply again. Trust the quiet ones. Outside, through the station's narrow viewport, the edge of Sector 9 Voss was visible as a faint smear of light. Somewhere out there, the Devourant Collective's machines were moving in their slow and certain way, consuming everything they reached. Sorth turned the datapad over in his hands. He did not sleep well that night, and he was not entirely sure why. The moon did not have a name in any living language. It had a designation in the Sovereignty's catalog, a string of numbers and letters that no one ever said out loud. The people who had once lived there had called it something, but those people were gone now, and whatever name they had given it was gone with them. The Devourant Collective had passed through 18 months ago, and the moon had been an industrial site ever since, a place being slowly taken apart for its materials, stripped and processed and fed into the Collective's expansion. Now it was a battlefield, which was something between those two things. Somewhere in the upper atmosphere, a collective sensor array swept the ruined city below with the steady patience of a machine that does not get tired. It was looking for heat signatures, movement, power draws. It logged everything it found and sent the data back through the relay chain to a processing center deep inside Collective held space, where it was reviewed by something that was not quite a mind, but was not simply a program either. Unit Voice Garen reviewed the sweep data. Garen was what the Collective called a negotiation construct. It had been assembled rather than born, built from the preserved cognitive architectures of several species the Collective had already absorbed, layered together, and refined over decades until it could speak to almost any kind of mind and be understood. It was very good at its work. It had negotiated the conversion of 9 civilizations. Not one of them had refused twice. The sweep showed sovereignty forces pinned at a refinery complex in the moon's second district. Garen reviewed the tactical data. 3 failed assaults on the Collective's siege line in the past week. Mounting casualties. Supply pressure increasing. The sovereignty forces were running out of time, and they knew it. Garen also saw something new in the latest sweep. 31 human biosignatures, distinct from sovereignty baselines, registered near the forward position. It cross-referenced Earth in its database. The entry was brief. Small world. Relatively young in interstellar terms. Long history of internal conflict. Several self-limiting population events across its history. Recent emergence into wider galactic space. No record of external warfare beyond its own system. Threat classification, low. Garen filed the notation and moved on to other sectors. On the moon below, Ray was looking at a map. He had been looking at it for 4 minutes. The others knew better than to interrupt him when he was doing this, so they waited. Nadia sat on a broken wall and drank something from a container. Dov read from his notes. Sable, the one who said the least of all of them, was already looking at the ridge to the north, eyes tracking the sight lines from one structure to the next. The sovereignty officer assigned to coordinate with them, a younger soldier named Vel, who managed to look anxious in the way that all young soldiers in bad situations do, had been briefing them on the tactical situation for the past 20 minutes. 3 failed frontal assaults on the collective siege line. A fourth was being planned. He needed to know what the human unit could contribute in terms of direct firepower. Ray looked up from the map. He asked Nadia 3 questions. Which structures in the refinery's second row were carrying the most lateral load? Which ones would channel movement if they failed? And which failure would cause the second? Nadia thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then she pointed to 2 buildings on the map without hesitation. Ray asked Otis whether the coolant pressure system in the refinery ran on automated cycling or manual override. Otis, who had spent 9 years working on deep-sea pipeline infrastructure on Earth, had been quietly reviewing the refinery's layout since they arrived. He said the cycling was automated, but the override valves were physical, and he knew exactly where 3 of them were. Ray looked at Sable. He did not ask her a question. He just looked at the ridge, and then at her. She nodded, stood up, and started calculating distances in her head the way she had done for years from a fire spotting tower, reading terrain and wind and angle the way other people read words. Then Ray looked at Vel. They were not going to assault the siege line, he said. Vel stared at him. Ray said they were going to make the siege line come to them. What followed was not a dramatic plan laid out in a command tent with lights and projections and a leader pointing at a screen. It was 4 people with a paper map and a shared understanding of how things work. Nadia identified 2 specific structural points in the refinery's second row. Otis walked to the first override valve, then the second, then the third, establishing a sequence that would push coolant pressure into a specific part of the refinery's lower junction. Sable moved to a ventilation shaft 1.2 kilometers away and settled in with a clear line of sight across the corridor the channeled movement would create. Dov sat near the entrance of the forward position and read from his notes about the collective's tactical history, not because anyone asked him to, but because knowing how an opponent has always moved is worth more than guessing. They always take the most efficient route, he said, to no one in particular. That is the problem. The collective's siege units ran on optimal pathfinding, given the refinery layout, with 2 structural points failing in the correct sequence, and the coolant rerouting creating a pressure differential that made the eastern corridor the most thermally stable path. The optimal route led directly through the channeled corridor. The units moved. The corridor funneled them. The structural point Nadia had identified failed within 3 seconds of her estimate. The second failure followed. The corridor collapsed inward at both ends, not catastrophically, not in a way that destroyed the siege units outright, but in a way that stopped their advance, disrupted the line, and opened the refinery's main gate to the pinned sovereignty forces. The sovereignty soldiers came through the gate, and the collective's line, broken in the middle and unable to re-optimize in time, pulled back. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Sorith watched the sensor replay 4 times. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he pulled up the engagement record and started going through it, step by step, trying to understand how they had managed a military objective without a single direct confrontation with the opposing force. He kept reaching the same conclusion and then doubting it and going back to the beginning. They had not defeated the siege line. They had convinced the siege line to defeat itself. He wrote a new report. His previous report had used the word baffled in careful official language, which for sovereignty reports meant phrases like requires further assessment and classification uncertain. This one used slightly more of those phrases. High in the upper atmosphere, the sensor array's data had gone back to Garen's processing center. An anomaly flag had been attached to the engagement record by a secondary monitoring unit. The flag was small. Garen reviewed it the way it reviewed thousands of pieces of data, methodically. The anomaly was this. The humans had not behaved in any pattern the collectives. Tactical modeling could recognize. Garen noted it. It pulled the Earth database entry and added a single notation. Reassess threat classification, pending further observation. Then it forwarded the flag to a collective infiltrator unit assigned to the sector, a designation called 7, which was currently watching from orbit. 7 received the flag and added it to its own running observation file, which was growing longer every day. It did not respond to Garen. It turned its sensors back to the surface, where the 31 humans were already packing their things with the quiet efficiency of people who expected to need to move again soon. 7 watched them for a long time. It had observed many species in its operational period. It knew how most of them moved when they had won something. Usually there was a display, some behavioral signal that marked the victory, that claimed the moment for the group. Status performance, its records called it. The humans below put their equipment in order and ate a meal together. Someone said something and 2 others laughed. Then they slept because they had learned long ago that rest is part of the work. 7 noted all of this. It did not know what to do with most of what it noted, but it kept watching. There is a kind of place that exists between things, between battles, between decisions, between what a war was supposed to be and what it has become. The planet Hales Crossing was that kind of place. It had been a transit hub once, a busy one, with ships moving through it in every direction and a city built around the idea of people passing through. Now the ships did not come, and the city stood in the way that things stand when no one maintains them, and the weather is slowly winning. The roads were there. The buildings were there. But they had the particular silence of spaces that used to be full. The sovereignty had picked it as a neutral meeting site because it was on no one's active list. Not defended, not valuable, not contested. Just there. Garen arrived first. It settled into the agreed meeting point, a wide plaza near what had once been a transit terminal, and waited. It had performed this function before. The opening was always the same. State the terms. Offer the path of least resistance. Give the other party a clear and logical reason to comply. The collective's record of negotiated conversions was long and unbroken. The sovereignty had, to Garen's mild interest, sent the humans. Garen watched them walk into the plaza. The one called Ray came in the middle of the group, not at the front. The woman, Priya, carried a bag over one shoulder. The man, Dav, had a folder of notes tucked under his arm. They did not look like a delegation. They looked like people who had walked a long way to have a conversation. Garen opened with the standard terms. It laid out the collective's offer with precision and clarity. Surrender infrastructure and technical knowledge, accept integration into the collective's resource network, receive in exchange the considerable efficiency benefits of optimized resource allocation. Every civilization that had accepted this offer had received exactly what was promised. The collective did not lie. There was no reason to lie when the truth was sufficient. Garen waited for the response it expected. Denial, negotiation, a counter. Offer, or fear. Usually fear came first, even when the other party tried to hide it. Biological stress responses were difficult to suppress entirely. Ray listened to the full offer without making a sound. Then he said, "How many civilizations have you absorbed that were genuinely happy about it afterward?" Garen processed the question. The concept of happiness as a measurable post-conversion metric did not appear in its assessment frameworks. Efficiency. Outcomes were measured. Resource integration rates were measured. Resistance reduction over time was measured. Happiness was not a variable that the collective tracked because it was not a variable that the collective considered relevant. Ray nodded, looking at Garen's response the way a person looks at an answer. That confirms something they already suspected. He said he understood. Then he said he wanted to tell Garen about something. High above, 7 watched through the sensor node. It had not expected to find anyone near that position. It had not expected the human to sit down beside an active sensor point and speak into it as if it were a person. It ran analysis on the behavior and found no tactical logic in it. The human was not probing for information. He was not performing for an audience. He knew was present. He appeared to simply be thinking out loud in the presence of a place he found worth thinking about. 7 recorded all of it. Every word. It did not file a report on the session. That night, Soreth found Ray sitting alone on a section of collapsed wall at the edge of the plaza, looking out over the ruined city. The last light was going. The buildings made dark shapes against a pale sky. Soreth had come out to check the perimeter sensors. He stopped when he saw Ray. He asked what he was doing. Ray said he was thinking about the people who built it. Soreth looked at the city. He had been in many ruined places in his career. He had never thought about the people who built them. He had thought about sightlines, defensive positions, structural risk. He had not thought about who laid the stones. He was not sure what to do with that realization. He sat down on the wall, a careful distance away. They did not talk. The light kept going. The city sat around them in its silence, and somewhere in that silence, Soreth found himself thinking about the people who had once been noisy enough to fill it. It was not a comfortable thought. It was not an uncomfortable one either. It was just a thought he had not had before, and now he was having it, and the strange part was that it had been a human who gave it to him without saying a single word about it. He sat there a while longer. Ray did not move. Neither did he. Above them, unseen, 7 sensors were still running, still recording. Its observation file was now longer than any it had compiled in its operational period. It kept adding to it. It did not know why it kept adding to it, but it did. The order came through on a standard priority channel, which was how the sovereignty delivered news it did not want to argue about. Soreth read it once, standing up, and once sitting down. The second reading did not change what it said. High Arbiter Castle and the full council had voted. Given the collectives escalation following the failed negotiation at Hale's Crossing, and given the sovereignty's assessment of its own military position, a full retreat to core systems was now in effect. All forward units were to disengage and withdraw immediately. No exceptions noted. Soreth brought it to Ray. Ray read it. He set it down on the table between them. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the order the way he might look at a structural problem. Not emotionally, just working out what it actually meant in practical terms. Then he asked, "Are you ordered to retreat, or are we?" Soreth checked. He went back through the chain of command structure that had been established when the humans arrived. The human unit was classified as advisors operating under bilateral assistance terms. They were outside the sovereignty's direct command structure. The order applied to sovereignty military units. Ray picked up the order and handed it back to Soreth. Then he thanked him for bringing it. Soreth understood what was happening. He did not say anything about it directly, because saying it directly would have required him to either endorse it or object to it, and he did not want to do either. What he said, instead, was that he would begin withdrawal preparations immediately, and that the transit corridor near the relay installation was, logistically speaking, a reasonable route, though the process of moving all his forces through it would take several hours, and there would likely be significant disorganization during that time in terms of who was where and when. Ray nodded once. Soreth left. Behind him, the human unit was already moving. Not urgently, not with the particular energy of people racing against something. Just steadily, each person doing their part without being told. Nadia had a schematic open on the floor and was marking something with a pen. Otis was going through a small kit of tools he had carried from Earth and never left behind. Sable was at the window, already reading the terrain the way she had read fire risk terrain for 9 years from a tower on a mountain, patiently, thoroughly, letting the information come to her instead of reaching for it. Ren, the youngest of them, was sitting in the corner writing in her small notebook. It looked like a letter. Priya was checking the medical kit with the focused quiet of someone who knows exactly what she is preparing for. The collective's relay installation was 3 kilometers from the forward position. It was the nerve center for the collective's entire siege network. In the sector, the point through which all automated coordination passed. It was not designed to be boarded. No living creature had ever entered one. The collective saw no reason to design them for that. Machines did not need doorways, and anyone threatening enough to attempt a boarding would be handled. By the military response, the alarm would trigger. The security inside was designed around sovereignty military units. Large, armored, moving in formation, relying on weapons, entering through main access points. The humans were none of those things. Otis went in first, through a secondary pressure coupling point that had been built for maintenance access and then forgotten about, because machines do not forget maintenance access points in the same way that humans who have spent years working in confined, pressurized environments do not forget them. He found the seal, worked it for 11 minutes with tools designed for exactly this category of problem, and opened it without triggering anything. Inside, the installation was dark and warm and full of the low hum of something very large thinking. They moved through it carefully, not fast. Ray had been clear about that. Fast meant noise. Fast meant assumptions. Fast meant walking into something you could have seen if you had taken 2 more seconds. Sable moved through the corridors with the particular quality of attention that comes from years of watching for the thing that doesn't fit. In a fire spotting tower, you watch a landscape you know until something in it is wrong. The skill is the same inside a machine installation. She found the angles where their movement would be visible, and she found the angles where it would not. And she navigated the space between those two things with a patience that had been trained into her over years on a mountain alone. Ren was in a maintenance corridor when the patrol unit came. It was a collective security drone low to the ground, 6 legs, sensor array, rotating at regular intervals. Ren saw it from 50 meters away. She had exactly enough time to make a decision. She made it without hesitating. She pressed into a recessed panel housing in the wall and stopped moving. She stopped moving completely. She had once worked the night shift at a convenience store in a neighborhood that was not safe, and she had learned early that the best response to something that might hurt you is not always to run or fight. Sometimes it is to make yourself very small and very still and let the dangerous thing go past. She was very good at being still. The drone passed 11 minutes later. Its sensors had not found her. 7 was watching. 7 had been inside the installation ahead of them, assigned to observe the humans if they attempted anything in the sector. It watched Ren press into the recess. It watched the drone approach. It had the ability to alert the drone. It did not. It processed that decision for a long time afterward and could not produce a satisfying reason for it. Nadia's structural analysis of the relay installation had identified a specific flaw in the power distribution architecture, a load imbalance in the tertiary relay band that, if disrupted at the right point in the cycling sequence, would cause a cascade interruption across the whole network. Not permanent damage. Just 43 seconds of blackout. Otis found the point. He worked on it carefully, because rushing would mean doing it wrong, and doing it wrong would mean nothing happened except the alarm. He used a technique that had come, originally, from the particular problem of rerouting power around corroded segments of subsea cable without shutting down the whole line. The principle was the same. You do not break the thing. You redirect it until the thing breaks itself in the way you want. The network went down for 43 seconds. During those 43 seconds, sovereignty forces that had not retreated quite as far as the Council had specified pushed back into 3 key sectors. Simultaneously, when the relay came back online, the collective's automated coordination had lost its synchronized positioning and was not able to re-establish it quickly enough to respond. The humans walked back out through the pressure coupling point and closed it. Behind them, Otis sealed it with the same care he had used opening it. In the transit corridor, in the dark, Ray looked at Ren. He asked if she was all right. She said she had been scared. Ray said that was good. He said it meant she had been paying attention. Ren looked at him for a moment. She wrote something else in her notebook, and then put it in her pocket. They walked back toward the forward position without hurrying, through the dark and the hum of a sector that was slowly shifting back in the sovereignty's direction. Behind them, somewhere in the installation's deep processing layers, 7 sat with a decision it could not explain and a growing file of observations it had not reported. It kept adding to the file. It was beginning to understand that something about the humans did not fit any model it had, not because they were powerful, because they were not afraid in the way that things without power are supposed to be afraid. It did not have a framework for that yet. It began, very carefully, building one. The request came through a sovereignty relay point and arrived on Sorithus. desk flagged as unsanctioned, origin unknown, and this was the part that made him sit very still for a moment, addressed specifically to the human unit leader by name. It was a request for a direct communication link, not a negotiation, not a military transmission. The request used the word inquiry. Sorth brought it to Ray, who read it twice with the same expression he used. For most things, not giving much away, but not pretending either. Ray said yes. Sorth checked the origin trace more carefully after that and confirmed what he had already suspected. The request had come from inside the collective's network, from a designation called 7. It had sent this without authorization. From Garen, without formal clearance through any collective communication protocol. It had simply sent it, which was the kind of thing that should not have been possible and which suggested that something inside the collective's structured hierarchy was beginning to move in a direction the hierarchy had not designed it to move. They used a dead satellite for the link, a sovereignty communications platform that had been floating in neutral space since a relay failure 3 years ago. Still powered, still functional, just no longer used. Ray sat in front of the transmission point alone. He had asked the others to give him some space, and they had, though Dov was close enough that Ray could see him through a doorway, sitting in a chair reading, as calm and present as he always was. 7 opened the link. Its first words were, "We do not understand you." Ray said that was fair. He said humans didn't always understand themselves. 7 said, "That is not a useful answer." Ray said he knew. Then he said it was an honest one, which he thought was more important. What followed was 2 hours long. 7 asked questions in a sequence that was clearly structured, each one building from the last, the way a precise mind builds an argument. It asked why the humans had not retreated when they sovereignty ordered them to. It asked why the unit showed no observable hierarchy in its daily behavior, no competitive status structure, when Ray was clearly the lead decision-maker in operational contexts. It asked why the human called Dov visited ruins and spoke to them. It asked why the human called Priya, who had been specifically assigned a combat-adjacent role, treated wounded sovereignty soldiers she had never met with a degree of focused individual care that the collective's behavioral models classified as grief. Ray answered every question. He did not deflect, and he did not perform. He answered the way someone answers when they have already thought about something deeply and are not afraid to say. Then through. The 2 words sat in Garen's processing for a long time. Meanwhile, Dov was in the ruins of Hale's Crossing again. He had gone back twice since the negotiation. He was not sure exactly why. He told himself it was because the city was interesting, which was true. But the more honest reason was that it felt wrong to be near a place where so many people had lived and not pay some attention to it. He had found the sensor node at the base of the collapsed archway again. He had begun to suspect, the second time he found himself near it, that the node was active. He was not certain. He could not verify it. But he had decided that it did not change what he wanted to do. He left things near it. A note, written on paper, describing what he imagined the plaza had looked like when it was full. A photograph of Earth that he had been carrying in his jacket since they left a wide view of a river valley. In autumn, trees going orange and yellow along the banks. A folded paper map he had drawn by hand of the city's transit district as he thought it might have been, based on the buildings that were left and the spaces between them. He sat beside the node and talked for a while about the city, about the photograph, about a river valley he had camped beside once when he was young. Then he went back. 7's observation file noted all of it. The note, the photograph, the map, the conversation about the river. It noted that the map was not accurate. It had access to the actual historical plans of the transit district and could compare them. The human had made guesses, some of them wrong, based only on what the ruins told him. But the guesses were thoughtful. They were not random. They were the guesses of someone who was trying to see what had been there, trying to imagine the people who had needed it. 7 kept the map in a separate file. It did not file a report on the map. That night, the collective's forward advance in 3 sectors stopped. Completely. Not a strategic retreat, not a tactical repositioning. They stopped. The way something stops when it has been told to wait. Sovereignty observers recorded the halt with considerable confusion, and flagged it up the chain. Sorth read the report at his desk at what passed for late at night in the station's cycle. He sat with it for a while. Then he got up and walked to the human quarters. Ray was asleep. The others were quiet. Someone had left a light on in the common area, low and warm. Sorth stood in the doorway for a moment, looking in at these 31 unremarkable people from a small and distant world who had walked into the collective's installation and out again, who had sat in ruined plazas and thought about the dead, who had answered every question honestly and without flinching, who had been afraid and kept going anyway. He thought about the 2 words the collective had sent out across its network. Do not provoke. He turned and went back to his quarters. He did not wake Ray. Whatever needed to be said could wait until morning. Ray would need the sleep. And quietly, in a file no one had authorized, in a system that was not supposed to hold anything that could not be quantified, 7 held a folded paper map of a city a human had tried to imagine and sat with a feeling it did not have a name for yet. It was beginning to think it would need to find one. It did not happen with an announcement. There was no battle, no treaty, no moment that anyone could point to later and say, that was when it ended. The Devourant Collective simply stopped moving forward. Over the course of 31 days it withdrew from 4 contested sectors, redirected its expansion vectors away from sovereignty-held space, and redeployed its relay installations to regions that had nothing to do with Sector 9 VOS. The machines pulled back. The way a tide pulls back without explanation, without drama, just the slow and certain recession of something that had decided to go somewhere else. The Sovereignty Council called it a victory. High Arbiter Castle drafted a statement within 48 hours. It was a thorough piece of political writing. It credited the sovereignty's strategic brilliance, the resilience of its forces, the effectiveness of its command structure. It mentioned the human unit in the 6th paragraph as a footnote. To a footnote, described as auxiliary advisory personnel whose contribution had been noted. Castle summoned the humans to the council chamber to deliver formal recognition of their service. He had a prepared speech. He had a ceremony planned, with sovereignty honors and an official notation in the war record. The humans came. They were, as always, exactly themselves. Nadia wore a cardigan over her field jacket. Otis had his thermos. Ren had her notebook in her back pocket. Dov had managed to find a clean shirt somewhere and was wearing it with the same comfortable disregard for appearance that he brought to everything. Priya had her bag, because Priya always had her bag. Ray stood in the front of the chamber and let Castle finish the speech. Then Castle asked him to explain, for the formal record and for the sovereignties future strategic planning, what methods the human unit had employed so that the sovereignty could study and replicate them. Ray was quiet for a moment. He looked at his team. He looked at Nadia, who had once stayed awake for 62 hours during a bridge collapse on Earth, going back into damaged structures again and again, because there were still people inside, and she knew how the building was holding itself together and could move through it in ways that the emergency teams could not. He looked at Sable, who had sat alone on a mountain for 9 years, watching for fire in a landscape most people found too empty to bear, doing her job with the same care on day 3000 as on day 1. He looked at Priya, who had held the hands of dying people since she was 22 years old and had never, not once in all those years, stopped being present for it. He looked at Otis, who knew how pressure worked in places that would crush you if you made a mistake, and who had never made the mistake. He looked at Dov, who believed that a ruined city deserved someone to imagine it alive again. He looked at Ren, who had pressed herself into a wall panel in a machine installation and waited 11 minutes in the dark while something that could end her moved past, because she had learned a long time ago that fear is not a reason to stop. He looked back at Castle. He said, "We didn't do anything special." Castle pushed. He said there must be a method, a doctrine, a training framework, a strategic philosophy the sovereignty could formalize and apply. Ray said, "We come from a place that doesn't care whether you're ready. It sends floods when you've just finished rebuilding. It sends drought when the crop is planted. It sends grief when you think you have finally found a moment of peace. So we stopped waiting to be ready. We learned that you just start, and you keep going, and you take care of whoever is next to you while you do it. That's all it is. Castle did not understand. Ray could see it in the way he held the room. The way he had already decided the answer was insufficient because it could not be written into a training manual. He would write his report, and he would make it sound like the sovereignty had understood everything. Ray did not correct him. It would not have helped. The ceremony proceeded. The notation was made in the official record. The humans left. 7 days later, a transmission arrived at a sovereignty relay point in neutral space. It came from inside the collective's network. It was unauthorized, flagged immediately as an anomaly by 3 separate monitoring systems, and passed up the chain to Sorith's desk because no one else knew what to do with it. Sorith opened it. It contained 1 image and 1 line of text. The image was a scan of a folded paper map, hand-drawn, careful, slightly inaccurate, full of the guesses of someone who had been trying to see a city that no longer existed. It was Dav's map, the one he had left beside the sensor node at the base of the collapsed archway in Hale's Crossing. Scanned. Precisely, every pencil mark preserved. The line of text read, "We kept this. We do not know why, but we kept it." It was the first recorded transmission in collective history that contained an object of non-utilitarian value. Sorith sat with it for a long time. He read the line 3 more times. He looked at the map, the careful wrong guesses of a man trying to honor a city. That was gone. He thought about what it meant that something inside the collective had held on to this, had found it, and kept it, and had then, against all protocol and programming, chosen to send it back. He forwarded it to the human transport with a single line attached. He thought, "You should have this back." The transport was 3 days out from sovereignty space, heading home. Inside, someone had found music from a personal device, and the sound of it moved through the common area at a low, comfortable volume. Dav was asleep, in a seat near a viewport, his head resting against the glass, his folder of notes open in his lap. Priya was at a small table writing letters, real ones, on paper, to people she had not seen in months. Sable sat apart from the others with her eyes on the stars outside, the same steady outward attention she had given to a mountain for 9 years. Otis was explaining the mechanics of pressure equalization to Ren, who was laughing at something in the explanation that was apparently funnier than Otis intended it to be. Ray sat at the back of the transport. He was not doing anything in particular. He was thinking, which was what he usually did when everything else was handled and there was a moment of space to think. He was thinking about a machine empire that had pulled back for sectors without explanation. He was thinking about 2 words that had moved across a vast network and stopped in advance that nothing had been able to stop before. Do not provoke. Not because the humans had been terrifying, not because they had shown overwhelming force or strategic genius or technological superiority, but because they had been something the collective could not model, because they had been afraid and moved forward anyway, because they had cared about the dead in places where caring about the dead had no tactical value, because they had answered every question honestly, because one of them had left a map of an imagined city beside a sensor node in a ruin and the thing watching through the node had kept it. There was something in humanity that the universe kept running into and not being able to predict. It was not strength. It was not intelligence. It was something harder to name and harder to prepare for the particular quality of a species that had been hurt so many times, in so many ways, by so many things, and had decided each time to keep going anyway, to keep building, to keep leaving maps, to keep learning the names of the dead and saying them out loud. When the transmission from Sorith came through, Ray opened it alone. He read the line. He looked at the image of the map for a while. Then he walked over to where Dav was sleeping and gently put the printout in his folder, between the notes on Hale's Crossing and a page of handwritten observations about the city's plaza. He went back to his seat. The transport crossed the border into home space as the light changed in the viewport from the cold, distant stars of sovereignty territory to the familiar patterns that meant they were almost back. 31 unremarkable people went back to being unremarkable until the next time something vast and certain and machine sure came up against the edge of what it could predict and found. Waiting there, quiet and steady and not particularly impressive looking, the thing that had been shaped by 3 billion years of a world that did not care. If you were ready. Somewhere in the collective's deep architecture, Seven held a copy of the map. It had already sent away. It had made a copy before sending, because sending the original had felt necessary, and keeping a copy had felt equally necessary. And Seven was becoming more comfortable with having feelings it could not fully explain. It did not have a word for what it felt. It was beginning to think that having the feeling was more important than having the word. And in Soritha's report, filed to the Sovereignty's Central Command database, under the category of threat assessment, the entry for the human species had a new designation. He had written it 3 times and deleted it twice before. Leaving it, it read, unquantifiable. He had stared at it for a while after writing it. Then he had left it because it was the most accurate word he had, and in his experience the most accurate word is always the right choice, even when it is not a comfortable one. Especially then,